Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on selling radio equipment in Ireland. This webinar is designed to help retailers and wholesalers understand what they need to do to comply with the regulatory regime. While we hope the webinar will be useful to manufacturers and importers, time isn't going to allow us to deal comprehensively with the obligations imposed on manufacturers and importers. My name is Frank Flanagan. I originally qualified as an engineer, so back in my early career I was actually signing declarations of conformity. Admittedly, they were for compliance with just the EMC directive and the low voltage directive rather than the radio equipment directive. But I have met these things in my past life. They're not quite as confusing as they probably appear at the outset. And really the object of this webinar is to encourage you to sell them, but adopting an appropriate and not terribly onerous approach. We're delighted to be presenting this webinar in conjunction with ComReg, and Tara Kavanagh from ComReg will be speaking to you on ComReg's approach to regulation and enforcement. My partner Wendy Hederman will be talking to you about some of the other aspects of the regulatory regime that likely affect the products you're going to be selling, and my colleague Morrough will be covering issues of product liability, which apply generally, but with an emphasis on where they apply to the types of products we're talking about today. If you could post any questions you've got to the chat at any stage throughout the webinar, we'll address as many of them as time allows at the end of the webinar. Okay, jumping straight into the issues. The first real issue that arises is what is radio equipment? Everybody, or many people, think it's something that looks like this, which is actually the 210-foot dish at Goldstone that was used to communicate with the Apollo satellites. People also probably acknowledge fairly simply that it includes things like mobile phones, walkie-talkies. Next slide, please. What is much less clear is that it also applies to things like smart light bulbs, lots of Bluetooth loudspeakers and headphones, Bluetooth or other forms of remote keyboards. It also applies to most cars, some washing machines if they've got a Bluetooth interface, which they do, some fridges and freezers, almost all laptops, and lots of other devices, and the scope of this is expanding very rapidly. Next slide, please. The definition from the Radio Equipment Directive says radio equipment means any electrical or electronic equipment that intentionally emits or receives radio waves for the purpose of radio communication or radio determination, which is basically radar. So the sniff test really is, if you don't know if a product is a radio product, if it says Wi-Fi, if it says Bluetooth, if it says wireless, if it says remote, it's probably radio equipment. We probably just need very briefly to talk about radio waves. Next slide, please. Any changing electrical signal is going to produce an electromagnetic wave. If the signal repeats, the number of times that it repeats a second is the fundamental frequency, which is measured in hertz. And most of the frequencies that are actually of interest when you start looking at this stuff are measured in millions of hertz, megahertz, or thousands of millions of hertz, gigahertz. Most equipment, if you go back to the washing machine, is designed to minimize the emissions in order to comply with the electromagnetic compatibility directive. So if it's not intended to produce radio waves, people are designing it to minimize the equipment. It's possible, it's easy to design equipment to transmit radio waves quite effectively, antennas on mobile phones or televisions or anything else. Deliberately transmitted EM waves are detected by receivers, bounced off aircraft, which is basically radar, used for navigation, GPS, and unimaginable number of other purposes. So unintentionally transmitted EM waves are also transmitted. They're referred to as noise. Or noise coming from intentional transmitters is also referred to as an out-of-band signal. So it's a signal that's not what you're trying to transmit. The big problem with radio waves is, like the air in a room with lots of people talking to one another at a reception, the space around the radio transmitter is one common channel for radio waves. So with that background, I'd like to talk very briefly about why it's necessary to regulate radio equipment, which hopefully provides an understanding as to why this stuff is going on. If multiple transmitters transmit at the same frequency or are too close to one another, they're likely to produce a reasonably strong signal at the receiver intended for each other and then interfere with one another. The normal way this is solved is by using different frequencies. If you look at, say, even at the FM radio band, all of the radio stations are transmitting unknown frequencies that you can tune your radio to. But frequencies are reused when the transmitters are sufficiently far apart that they produce a negligible signal at receivers intended for another transmitter. So all the FM frequencies that are used in Ireland for radio are reused in the UK. But how far apart the transmitters need to be is dependent on the frequency used at the power level and the power level. At, say, the long wave frequencies, an RTE does have a long wave transmitter. It's just off the air at the moment. The RTE transmitter suffers occasionally from interference from a transmitter in France. By contrast, though, there are shorter range devices, and Tara is going to talk a little bit more about them. Bluetooth probably won't make it beyond one room. Conventional Wi-Fi, as everybody I think knows at this stage, often can't cover an entire house without boosters. So it really depends on what frequencies you're looking at. And in order to bring some order to the use of the radio spectrum, somebody has to regulate and decide who can use what frequencies. Second reason you have to regulate is the Irish market is actually far too small for anybody to design cost-effective equipment solely for use in Ireland. Consumers expect to travel with their laptops, their Wi-Fi headphones, their wireless headphones, and they expect to be able to use them in every country they travel to. So there are international agreements covering what radio frequencies can be used for most products and the type of signal that can be transmitted on those frequencies. There are also some residual national discretions, which we'll talk about very briefly, but in general, they don't affect common consumer products. And the final reason to regulate, the final big reason to regulate is that the EU is a single market. The EU needs to promote the free movement of goods between member states. So the EU has introduced a common regulatory framework for industrial goods, which includes radio equipment. And the current version of that is known as the new legislative framework. And it consists primarily of directives which are transposed into Irish law by way of regulations. This slide is actually probably slightly scary to anybody who hasn't seen the NLF before. There are a few generic level instruments that basically set out the framework and include the General Product Safety Directive. Then there are about 30 specific instruments: the Radio Equipment Directive, the EMC Directive, and the Low Voltage Directive are the three I want to talk about. Wendy will talk about some of the others later on. They relate to everything from pressure vessels to fluorescent lights. And all of those directives are transposed into Irish law by way of Irish regulations. There are also some miscellaneous provisions that impact on these products, like the Safety, Health, Welfare and at Work regulations, EMC, Electromagnetic Field Regulations 2016, which impact on electromagnetic fields in the workplace. There's the ICMIRP guidelines, which look at the medically safe exposure to non-ionizing radiation, the Irish wiring regulations. And then there's two pieces of Irish primary legislation, the Communications Regulation Acts, which basically establish ComReg and set its objectives, and the Wireless Telegraphy Acts, which deal with the licensing of radio equipment in Ireland. And that brings me to an aside on licenses. The default position is that all radio equipment in Ireland requires a license unless it's subject to an exemption. ComReg publishes a list of license exemptions that's readily available, and this covers things like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi when it's used at appropriate frequencies, cordless telephones, car alarm remotes, and lots of other devices. If you're selling other equipment, for instance, professional audio and video equipment, you'll find that the licensing regime and the allowable spectrum for that may not be the same in Ireland as it is in the UK and Europe, and you do actually need to check carefully. And this actually matters because if the equipment needs a license and your customer doesn't have a license, the customer commits an offence just by having it. You actually don't commit an offence by having it for sale, but the customer commits an offence by having it. Okay. We need to now look very briefly at something slightly strange. The Low Voltage Directive basically regulates the safety of electrical equipment. And the CPCC, the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, is responsible for regulating monitoring compliance with that directive. But if the washing machine has a Bluetooth interface, responsibility for the Low Voltage Directive falls to ComReg. And this is because as it has a Bluetooth interface, it's radio equipment and has to comply with the radio equipment regulations. And the radio equipment regulations effectively disapply the Low Voltage Directive, but then immediately under the radio equipment regulations, apply the essential requirements of the Low Voltage Directive directly, but without voltage limits. So a product that's at too low voltage to be subject to the LVD, or indeed a product that's at too high voltage to be subject to the LVD. For instance, there's sort of high voltage switchgear in various products for which a radio interface is very nice because it's a lot safer than physically connecting something. All of them are actually subject to the LVD. Okay, from that, let's look at why interference matters. Everybody's familiar if they put their mobile phone beside a piece of audio equipment and the phone starts to ring, they're going to get interference on the audio equipment. And that doesn't necessarily seem too bad. But in the worst case, interference can affect a life-critical service. So it can create, say, a false signal on a radar that looks like an aircraft. Less seriously, it can mean that licensed users can't actually get the performance they expect out of the frequencies they have licenses for. So, for instance, it could interfere with wireless broadband. It could interfere with the performance of the systems used by the Gardaí. And finally, equipment can interfere with bands that are not currently used by somebody, but that ComReg expects to license in the near future, or that the EU expects to license in the near future. So even if the interference generated by your equipment doesn't look like it's causing a problem today, it probably will have to be dealt with. The other side of the coin from interference is immunity. Can equipment cope with the expected environment? If the equipment you're selling, this is just an example, crashes when your mobile phone rings, it's probably not appropriately immune. By way of example, ComReg is currently licensing in the process of licensing the 2.6 gigahertz band for use by wireless broadband. There are radars used by the Irish Aviation Authority that are overly sensitive to signals in the 2.6 gigahertz band. They're actually supposed to be using the 2.7 gigahertz band, but those radars are having to be upgraded and modified. If they were proposed today, I don't think anybody thinks they would have appropriate immunity to allow them to be sold under the Radio Equipment Directive. Now, all of this looks horribly confusing. The key message is don't panic. As a retailer, There's a document called the Blue Guide, which is published by the EU. It's going to be updated shortly, which contains almost all the information you need, along with a lot of information that you probably don't need. And section 3.4 of the Blue Guide sets out the duty of what it calls distributors. So at this stage, we probably need to look very briefly at who the actors are in the supply chain. And the EU effectively wants to capture all of the economic operators and look at their obligations. The manufacturer of equipment has fairly onerous obligations. They have to set out how the equipment actually complies with all of the relevant legislation and standards. And then they have to affix the CE mark. The manufacturer can have an authorized representative in the EU, but they're not required to. And that representative can carry out certain acts on behalf of the manufacturer and has fairly significant duties. The importer into the EU has much lighter duties than the manufacturer, but there's still a few bits and pieces they have to do in terms of satisfying themselves as to what the manufacturer has done. And distributors, which includes retailers and wholesalers, have fairly light duties. They basically have to carry out some level of diligence, and they have to know where they're getting the goods from. What's important to note here is that distributors actually don't have to have any special relationship with the manufacturer. It's not like you have a distribution contract with the manufacturer. All that's required is that you're distributing the goods for you to fall to be considered as a distributor under this legislation. Now, one of the problems is if a distributor, it's easy to change roles here. If a distributor sells a product under its own name, it becomes or takes on the role of the manufacturer. So if you sell a big Far Eastern Electronics Wi-Fi hub, you're a distributor or possibly an importer. If you sell the same product as your company's Wi-Fi hub, you take on all of the responsibilities of the manufacturer, and that is a fairly onerous set of responsibilities, and it requires that you have a fairly deep technical understanding of the product. The other thing is if you import a product from outside the EU, which since Brexit includes the UK, you become the importer and you take on the responsibilities of the importer. So you do need to think about those steps fairly carefully. Okay. Basically, the Radio Equipment Directive is set up to try to ensure that equipment is compatible and that it's safe. So RED actually regulates very few things, and it's mostly done via the standards that are published relative to RED. It's basically regulating the frequencies at which equipment operates, the maximum power you can radiate, the maximum unintentional power you can radiate, and electrical safety. So what the Blue Guide actually says about distributors is that they need to be able to demonstrate to the national authorities, which is ComReg, that they've acted with due care, that they have affirmation from the manufacturer or the importer that the necessary measures have been taken, and that they need to be able to assist the national authority, ComReg again, in its efforts to obtain the required documentation. So basically this means you need to see a declaration of conformity. You need to get the manufacturer or your supplier to tell you the product is compliant. You need to believe them that the product is compliant without closing your eyes to things that are obvious issues. You need to sell only radio equipment that has a declaration of conformity, that has instructions that in a language that your users are likely to understand, which in Ireland probably means English or Irish, and Irish is very unlikely. You need to know how many of the units you've sold, and you need to cooperate with ComReg if you're asked questions. And we'll return to this in a slightly more generic manner at the very end of the webinar. And I'd now like to ask Tara to talk to you about ComReg's approach to regulation and enforcement.
Thank you, Frank, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tara Kavanagh, and I'm the Senior Manager for Spectrum Operations with ComReg. And in my short presentation this afternoon, I will just give you a brief overview of who ComReg is, what we do, and why we do it. So ComReg is the statutory body responsible for the regulation of the electronic communications sector. So that's telecommunications, radio communications, broadcast transmission, the premium rate services, and the postal sector. And one of ComReg's functions is to manage Ireland's radio spectrum, which is a finite national resource that's used to provide a wide range of wireless communication services, including radio and TV broadcasting, mobile telephony, and wireless broadband. And in addition to being the manager of the radio spectrum, ComReg is designated as the sole market surveillance authority with respect to the RED. And in this regard, ComReg's role is to ensure that all radio equipment placed on the market is compliant with the relevant provisions of the RED, including the requirements to ensure the health and safety of persons, domestic animals, and property, as well as to avoid harmful interference to the radio waves. As Frank mentioned, such harmful interference can impact the provision of other wireless communication services, be that emergency services or mobile telephony services. Next slide, please. So radio communication enables the use of many of the consumer devices that we're all familiar with. Your wireless headphones, your Wi-Fi router, your smartwatch, your wireless doorbells, etc. And we're all aware that every year more and more radio-enabled devices and equipment come onto the market. The ITU predicts that worldwide the number of connected devices on the internet will reach 50 billion by 2025. And Ericsson has predicted there will be around 29 billion connected devices by 2022, of which 18 billion will be related to IoT. And scaling this for Ireland, we estimate that this will be around 57 million devices, all of which will fall under the RED and many of which will be subject to the LVD. Many of these devices fall into the category of short-range devices, or SRDs. So SRDs are radio devices that offer a low risk of interference because their transmitted power and hence their range is very low. So SRDs include things like door and gate openers, CCTV, smart meters, and Wi-Fi. And SRDs, as Frank mentioned, benefit from a relaxed regulatory regime compared to other radio communications equipment. And as a general principle, users of such equipment are exempt from requiring a license. However, in order for such a vast range of devices to coexist with each other, they must play by the rules. So, like all radio equipment, SRDs have to meet the requirements of the RED to be placed on the market. The operation of the equipment is subject to frequency management regulations, which are set out by ComReg in document 0271R. And this document is updated regularly to keep pace with equipment changes. Next slide, please. So this significant increase in the number and range of radio devices expected to come on the market in the coming years will give rise to a consequent increase in ComReg's market surveillance activities in respect of RED. And in order to address this, ComReg has established a product safety unit, which is tasked with conducting proactive and reactive market surveillance. So this is done in close cooperation with key stakeholders such as customs, other market surveillance authorities, both national and international, as well as with product testing houses in the EU. And in addition, ComReg engages proactively with economic operators, product users, and uses its website as a tool to raise awareness around radio equipment and the obligations on economic operators there. Next slide, please. So, one of the key goals of market surveillance is to make sure that products are produced to a minimum standard and that there is a level playing field for all products. So ComReg's approach to market surveillance is led by the attitude of the economic operators to compliance. So ComReg will assist economic operators try to comply, but don't always succeed with the obligations of the RED. However, if non-compliance is a result of deliberate action or inaction on the part of an economic operator, ComReg will use the full force of all of its powers to bring about compliance. Next slide, please. So ComReg has a range of powers which it is ready, willing, and able to use as the circumstances dictate. ComReg has the power to carry out inspections of radio equipment upon entry into the state. And this is done in close cooperation with customs at the airports, ports, and mail centres, where non-compliant equipment is identified, tested, and seized prior to being placed on the market. In addition, ComReg can issue directions to economic operators in respect of product withdrawals, recalls, and the application of sanctions to stop circulation of non-compliant products or to bring about compliance of those products. ComReg can make an application to the High Court to compel an economic operator to comply with the direction that has not been complied with. And ComReg also has the power to obtain search warrants where to enter and examine equipment where it believes there is a reasonable grounds for it to believe that there is radio equipment being stored, distributed, and sold. And it also has the power to search any place, process, or radio equipment therein. Next slide, please. So ComReg is very mindful that as we approach the second half of this year, many retailers will be considering purchasing radio equipment for sale in the run-up to the Christmas period. And it's really important that retailers and their buyers ensure that any radio products that they hope to sell are compliant with the RED. So my key message to you today is really just to make sure that your buyers are aware of the obligations that are imposed by the RED. Make sure that all radio equipment has a CE mark affixed to it, that it is accompanied by a declaration of conformity, instructions for use and safety information, and it must be constructed with agreed European standards. The devices must be made for sale for use in the EU market, and any devices not compliant with the RED will be seized by ComReg. Non-compliance is not victimless. Aside from the potential to cause harm to the health and safety of persons, domestic animals, and property, there is also the potential to adversely impact wireless communication services, such as emergency services. So it's really important that you and your buyers know the obligations and put in processes and procedures to help you meet them. And it's important that if you need to, you can engage with ComReg for assistance. Next slide, please. There are lots of resources out there to help you in this regard. As Frank mentioned, there's the Blue Guide. There's also a red guide and a supplementary guidance in relation to LVD, EMC, and RED. And all of these documents are available on the official journal of the EU. ComReg has made a lot of information available on its website with useful links to additional information. And ComReg also publishes an annual report setting out what it does in relation to market surveillance. This is published in the Spectrum Intelligence and Investigations Annual Report. And amongst a number of other things, it sets out what we do in relation to market surveillance. Information is there around the range and number of products that we have seized and actions taken. And it also sets out what ComReg plans to do in relation to market surveillance for the year ahead. ComReg will be publishing its SII annual report for the period 2020 to 2021 in Q3 of this year. And you'll find that some useful information for you there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. I think it was actually very useful I hope it was very useful for people to get an insight into what ComReg's role is and how ComReg interacts with retailers and wholesalers. I'd now like to hand over to Wendy Hederman, who's going to talk about the other elements of the legislative framework that are likely to affect the radio equipment you sell.
Thanks, Frank. So apart from the radio equipment directive that we've been discussing, what else must the products conform with? Well, as we know, all the goods we've been discussing today must display a CE mark. And a CE mark is an indication that products conform to all applicable EU product regulations. It must apply to all of the regulations that are relevant, depending on what else is in the product or what else it does, or what substances are in it. So a CE mark, it's not a quality mark. It's not an indication of origin. It is a confirmation essentially from the manufacturer. And essentially a manufacturer can, and in fact he must, affix the CE mark once he has verified compliance of the product with all of the product specific rules which apply to that product. And there were at least 30, more than 30 product specific regulations listed in the annex to the Blue Guide as part of the new legislative framework. And since that Blue Guide list in 2016, the number of product specific regulations has been added to, and a lot of those regulations and directives which were listed have been updated and replaced. So as far as we go to the next slide, as Frank indicated and has already outlined here in the section that I've marked in red, we have in the navy colouring is the specific directives as part of NLF that he's been talking about: radio equipment directive, electromagnetic compatibility, and low voltage. And that's not all, they're not the only ones. I'm going to go to the next slide now to show you some of the others. So as well as radio equipment, low voltage, and EMC, the other ones that we find are most relevant for our clients who are either importing goods with radio in them or that are retailing these goods. The most relevant ones are the WEEE directive, waste from electrical and electronic equipment, and/or batteries directive. And I'm going to come back to more specifically to the obligations within the WEEE and the batteries directive. I've listed there in the slide what's the Irish regulation that implements that EU directive. And you'll see from the first two that the responsible authority for these is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. They also are the authority responsible for the next one that comes up a lot, RoHS, or restriction of hazardous substances. That's from 2011. In fact, that's the recast RoHS, and we're effectively on RoHS 3 at this point. The Irish regulation for that is listed in the middle column, 513 of 2012, also under the auspices of the Environmental Protection Agency. And persistent organic pollutants, or POP, the 2019 regulation, which it controls things like the use of pesticides or DDT or PCBs which can be released when manufacturing electrical equipment. Environmental Protection Agency is also the responsible authority for that. You then have things like the eco-design directives. And as you probably know, the eco-design, which are for certain energy related products, is a framework directive, and it sets out energy efficiency standards for energy products with the aim of improving energy efficiency of more than about 20 product groups. And this includes things such as household appliances, ICT equipment, and in fact, there are a lot more product groups that are going to come within the scope of the eco-design requirements. And we list them here because meeting the requirements of these directives for those product groups, it forms part of the conformity assessment process, which is required for and will result in the CE mark being affixed. And the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland is responsible for checking compliance with eco-design regulations and providing advice to retailers and consumers on eco-design. It's well worth, and I'm sure you are familiar with the product groups that are covered by eco-design regulations, everything from refrigerators, dishwashers, external power supplies, electronic displays. And actually one of the successes of the eco-design regulations and directives is that because it has been product specific, the requirements for each product, as to whether spare parts should be available for a dishwasher or washing machine for 5 years or 7 years, or what's the energy level for a power supply, they're quite product specific, and that has contributed greatly to gradual improvements in the energy efficiency of the various product groups under the eco-design directives. We should also mention there the REACH regulation, because that's a regulation, it's directly effective in Ireland, but the Chemicals Act is what facilitates the enforcement of the REACH regulation in Ireland, and that's under the auspices of the Health and Safety Authority. As I say, there are lots more specific regulations. The sort of ones which could be relevant for retailers on this call are, toys directive. Certainly there are toys that have connected elements, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. Toys directive could be PPE. It covers things like sunglasses and ear protectors. Also medical devices, more and more we're seeing, and as you know, medical devices are highly regulated, certainly since the introduction of the MDR just at the end of May, the end of last month, deferred for a year because of COVID. But medical devices now starting to apply to sort of consumer software products like health trackers. So without too much more ado, I'm going to come back now to the next slide, please. The WEEE and batteries. And the reason I picked out these two directives is because while most of the other product-specific regulations have a very common set of obligations that apply to retailers or distributors, and their obligations are kind of very much just secondary to or flowing from the obligations on the producer or manufacturer and on the importer. With these two regulations, the WEEE and batteries, there are particular obligations for retailers which don't apply to, or you can't just assume that the manufacturer has done the compliance. So with WEEE, we're largely talking about those products that have the crossed out wheelie bin symbol on them. And that's one of the first obligations for manufacturers, is to ensure that the crossed out wheelie bin symbol is marked on the device, or if it can't be fitted on the device because of size, well then it can, as a sort of exception, be on packaging or on a sticker attached to the product. The body in Ireland, as I said, responsible for WEEE and batteries is the Environmental Protection Agency. I've done this table borrowing from useful outline of obligations on the EPA website, and there's something similar on the WEEE Ireland website. But so what do retailers have to do? Well, you have to register either the local authority or by joining a compliance scheme. And the registration has to be not just by retailer, but by retail premises. Each of the premises that gathers or takes back WEEE or batteries. And when I say there under batteries, there is an exception. If a retail outlet only supplies batteries that are portable, then it will not have to register. But any other batteries, industrial batteries, or larger ones not of the portable size, well then they have to register. The second main obligation is only selling electronic equipment or batteries that are supplied from fully registered producers. And that applies to both WEEE and batteries. And it means that as a retailer, you are pretty much required to check the producer registration number. The registers are available, and it is expected that a retailer will verify that who it has purchased from is fully registered. The retailer also has to display visible environmental management costs at the point of sale. That only applies to WEEE, and it's to do with what portion of the cost comes back from the sale price of the goods. Retailers also obliged to take back from customers free of charge, and there's a slight difference here. For electrical equipment, you have to take back on a one-for-one basis. So if you sell electrical equipment, you take back a similar item from the consumer, whereas batteries required to take back batteries regardless of whether the consumer has bought batteries from you at that particular time. That's a 1-for-0 basis. Under both WEEE and batteries, you have to display a statutory notice advising people that they can recycle their WEEE or their batteries in your store, some related information. You must provide information to customers. Now, this is often looked after by the manufacturer within the product instructions, but it can also be done in a point of sale leaflet. Retailers also have the obligation to store and transport the WEEE or batteries safely and legally. And with batteries, there is the potential for fire. So it is important that they're stored safely. And also they must keep records in relation to the quantities of wee taken back, stored and removed from premises. And there are various reporting schemes, including sort of black box for wee. So I hope that gives you a good idea on obligations. We might move, Frank, to the next slide. I just wanted to take the opportunity to mention a few developments, because in this area of law, particularly across the product regulation and in a lot of consumer protection legislation, there are quite big changes coming about. So as our previous speakers mentioned, the Blue Guide is a good source of information and kind of does very much flesh out and fill out the picture on what are the obligations on manufacturer, importer, and distributors under the products regulation. That guide dates from 2016, and now 5-6 years on, there are parts of it that it's felt are in need of updating. During the past year, the EU Commission has been working on a revision to it, and the update was expected to be published in mid-2021. And as we've just passed the longest day of the summer, we're just about around the mid-2021. I'm keeping an eye out daily for the update of the Blue Guide. What we do know from the draft that we saw last year is that areas of the guide that will be updated relate particularly to digital economy, to software, e-commerce of that area, because these concepts of placing goods on the market, it's fairly obvious when you're talking about physical goods which actually get moved along the supply chain from manufacturer to importer to wholesaler. But for online sales, there's often a shortened supply chain, and or for software, there's can be a completely different supply chain. So we are expecting in the updated guide, there will be changes around placing on the market for online sales, and it's likely to mirror what is in the market surveillance regulations regarding fulfillment services, particularly for non-EU manufacturers, and where the only economic agent that is within the EU between manufacturer, non-EU manufacturer and consumer is a fulfillment service provider, that they are likely to be placed with obligations and maybe in this category of responsible economic operator, and their name will have to be on the label. For software, the revised draft is expected to look more at product safety, about updates and the risk assessment that needs to be redone, particularly safety in the context of sort of cyber risks and connectivity. The one area that I think is of particular interest to retailers is this area of instruction manuals. We often get the question from clients, oh, can we put the instruction manual online so we don't have to print it? It's much more eco-friendly. We're not putting a booklet of 50 pages into the box. And the Blue Guide is expected to confirm that the user manual or instruction manual can be online or accessible by a QR code, but the basic safety information will still have to be printed on paper in the box. And the one that I skipped over there, there'll be a lot more focus, I think, on the difference between remanufactured products, modified products, and repaired products. And it's both in the context of, well, because of the initiatives on sustainable products and circular economy, there's a lot more focus on this area. But the area that the Blue Guide is likely to deal with is, well, when does a person who repairs or modifies or remanufactures a product, when does that trigger a new conformity assessment? When can you continue to rely on the original CE assessment and marking that was done? And when is a product considered to be changed to the extent that it requires a new CE conformity assessment to be done? We're also very soon going to get revisions to the machinery directive, the low voltage directives that we were discussing, and batteries directive and eco-design. Let me just briefly on batteries. There was a consultation by the Commission earlier this year, which I think closed 1st of March 2021, And that consultation makes it clear that there are going to be new rules across the entire life cycle of batteries, focusing mostly on safety, sustainability, and the ecological impacts of batteries and their end of life. And very briefly, because we're probably running out of time, on eco-design, this is an area that I've been tracking a lot because of the Sustainable Products Initiative. Eco-design, which I mentioned already, is going to be extended to a lot more products. So mobile phones and tablets and that sort of consumer technology is going to be included in the eco-design directives. And we see more of that as part of the Sustainable Products Initiative. So that's not the only changes. The General Product Safety Directive and the Liability for Defective Products Act, or Liability for Defective Products Directive, are also undergoing change. But for all of that, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Aisling, who's going to talk you through the General Product Safety Directive obligations first. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy, and good afternoon, everyone. This is a very high-level overview of the legislative framework governing product liability claims in Ireland. Product liability is the area of law in which manufacturers, distributors, suppliers, and retailers may be held responsible for injuries that products may cause. And the main areas of law and regulation in Ireland are set out just on that first slide. You've got strict liability claims. They arise under the Liability for Defective Products Act 1991, which implements the EU Product Liability Directive. Claims in contract are principally governed by the Sale of Goods Acts 1893 and 1980, as well as the 2003 regulations that transposed into Irish law the EU Directive on the Sale of Goods and Associated Guarantees. At common law, under negligence, a manufacturer or a seller may be liable for a defective product. And finally, in terms of criminal liability, a liability arises under the European Community's General Product Safety Regulations 2004, which transposed into Irish law the General Product Safety Directive. Next slide, please. So turning to the first one, the Liability for Defective Products Act. Primary liability lies with the producer of a product where damage is caused wholly or partly by a defect in their product. The 91 Act operates a system of strict liability, and so the negligence of the defendant is irrelevant. It's a no-fault basis. A product is defective if it fails to provide the safety which a person is entitled to expect. And a product is not defective solely because a better product is subsequently put on the market. A producer includes a number of economic operators, including a person who holds themselves out to be the producer through the use of a name or a trademark applied to a product. Any person who has imported the product into the EU from outside the member states, including now from the UK as well. And in addition to those, where a producer cannot be identified by taking reasonable steps, any person who has supplied the product may also be held liable as a producer. And as Wendy has just remarked, the EU Product Liability Directive is currently under review by the European Commission, arising from concerns that it may not adequately address the challenges raised by new technological developments. And we are awaiting the outcome of that review, and it is expected, mid to late 2021. Next slide, please. So product liability claims in contract. Generally speaking, a seller will only be liable in contract to the buyer with whom they have contracted. A consumer can bring a claim for breach of contract if the product doesn't comply with the terms of the contract, both express and implied, and as a result they have suffered loss, damage or injury. A consumer may rely on their contractual rights with the seller, even regardless of whether the product has a warranty or a guarantee from the manufacturer. The Sale of Goods Acts and the 2003 regulations imply a number of contractual obligations on the seller, including that the goods must be in conformity with the contract, meaning that they must be of merchantable quality, fit for purpose, and as described. And significant changes are coming to the Sale of Goods Acts. They're due in the next 6 months, particularly for goods with digital elements, which retailers should keep an eye out for. Next slide, please. Turning now to claims in negligence. A claim may be brought by a purchaser, a person who uses the product, or a third party who is injured or has suffered damage by the product, where the claimant alleges that the defendant was negligent and that the negligence caused their injury or damage. Typically, a claim will be brought against the manufacturer of a defective product, but liability isn't limited to the manufacturer, and other parties in the supply chain, including suppliers and distributors, may also be held liable if they're shown to have been negligent. An economic operator may be liable in negligence for a defective product where a duty of care is owed to the claimant. There was a breach of that duty of care, and that breach has resulted in damage to the claimant that is also reasonably foreseeable. And then last slide, please. Turning then to the general product safety regulations. They prohibit the placing of unsafe goods on the market. The general product safety regulations impose obligations on producers and distributors to ensure that goods placed on the market are safe and do not pose a risk to consumers. Producers must also ensure that products are accompanied with appropriate warnings to consumers and instructions for use. The term producers includes the manufacturer of a product, the manufacturer's representative, the importer of the product, and other professionals in the supply chain insofar as their activities may affect the safety of the product. Distributors also have specific obligations under the regulations. They must ensure that any products they supply to consumers are safe, and after the product has been placed on the market, they have an ongoing obligation to monitor its safety. If they become aware of a defect or a risk posed by the product, a distributor has a duty to inform the consumer, the producer, and the relevant authority, which in Ireland is the Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, or the CCPC, of those defects or risks posed by the product. They must also keep and provide the CCPC with documentation necessary to trace the origins of the product and to cooperate with the CCPC in any action that it takes. And again, these regulations and its originating directive is subject to review at European Commission level, and we're waiting the outcome of that as well. And I think it is expected to be published from the mid to the end of 2021. So that covers our whistle-stop tour of the Irish product liability regime. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'll hand back to Frank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aisling. I'd just like to sort of close the presentation piece of this by briefly reviewing the obligations for distributors that largely cover all of the legislation we've talked about. Essentially, you need to ensure that industrial equipment you sell is accompanied by a declaration of conformity. So it must have a piece of paper with it that on which somebody says, we certify that this complies with, and lists the various things. That it lists all of the relevant directives. So to take an example that goes outside the range that Wendy was talking about, if you're selling, say, an air compressor that has a Bluetooth interface, there's a pressure vessels directive. It needs to comply with that. That it has a CE mark that can't be removed without leaving a residue. That it's purchased from a known entity. You're likely, if problems arise, to need to identify your supplier to the relevant regulator. That the vendor or the manufacturer will give you the test reports on request. That if the vendor is not in the EU, you take the necessary steps required of an importer, because if you're buying it from the UK, you are now the importer into the EU. Next slide, please. You need to ensure that the radio equipment appears to be safe. For instance, if on unpacking boxes you're finding a percentage of things broken with exposed wires, it's not safe. You can't close your mind to a problem with it. You need to preferably ensure that it appears to work as intended, that it's accompanied by instructions in a language likely to be understood. You need to keep records of how many of the units you have sold, because that's information the regulator may require from you. You need to check that the declaration of conformity appears to make sense and relates to the actual product being sold. It's not uncommon, and I've seen declarations of conformity that relate to a model 2 or 3 years out of date. You need to keep a copy of the declaration of conformity because the regulator may ask you for that. And if you've done all of the above and you cooperate with ComReg requests, probably worst that can happen to you if there's no safety related issues is that you could be required to recall radio equipment. With that, I think if everybody can actually turn their cameras back on, and we'll address some of the questions. By the way, you will all have received a survey. If you could take a couple of minutes to fill in the survey, that would be much appreciated. The first question there, what can the average person do if they find a non-CE marked or fake CE marked device? What will ComReg do to the seller of this equipment? I think, Tara, that's probably one for you, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess if you come across a device that you think is fake or doesn't have a CE mark, my first response would be, as an average person, don't buy it. If you're anyway unsure about its bona fides. Secondly, you can make ComReg aware of the product and where you bought it, and give the product to us for testing, so we can see if it complies with the OED. And then we will engage with the seller, and depending on the nature of the risk associated with that product in terms of the potential harm to the health and safety of persons, domestic animals and property, we will then determine whether that product needs to be withdrawn, recalled, taken off sale, or brought about in compliance. So it's really dependent on the circumstances, but that would be the approach that we would take.
The second question there, we've been buying products made in the Far East via a UK company for years. What should we do now? Let me take that to start with. I think ideally see if you've got an alternative path to buy it from a sister company of that company's, buy it via Holland or Germany or some other EU state. If you can't do that, you need to take a step back, take a look at the obligations imposed on distributors, importers. And if you're handling enough of the product, you can look at taking on the role of the importer into the EU, but you have to accept that by importing from the UK, you are the importer into the EU. Tara, do you want to add anything to that, maybe? Or are you happy enough with that?
Yeah, I'm happy, Frank. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Next question going down. The declaration of conformity on one of the products that we are selling relies on a UK notified body. Is this okay post-Brexit? Unfortunately, it's not okay post-Brexit. It's necessary to, if a manufacturer is relying on a notified body, which are specific bodies that are notified to the EU, whose test facilities are sort of calibrated and monitored, that it be an EU notified body. There will probably, I think, be a degree of tolerance, perhaps for the next few months, perhaps for the rest of the year, but you will have to actually get the manufacturer to resolve that issue quite quickly. Tara, anything to add to that, or are you?
Only to say that we do have a number of notified bodies operating here in Ireland. So if that's something that that you could use rather than using a UK notified body, and we can assist you with identifying some of those notified bodies if you don't know who they are.
Next question going down. As they use radio waves or microwave ovens radio equipment. Do you want to take that one, Tara?
Yes, they are radio equipment. So they operate in what's talked about or considered the ISM band, the industrial, scientific and medical band. So they operate in 2.4 gigahertz band, but they do have a radio element, and therefore they are radio equipment, and are treated in that manner.
I've heard that there are new EU laws about digital goods and content that will affect the sale and kind of radio products, connected products we're talking about today. And there's a question mark after that. I'm not sure what the question actually is. If somebody wants to resend that. Can you make sense of it, Wendy?
Yeah, no, I can see it there in the box. I think, will it affect sale of radio products we're talking about? I think from that it's talking about goods with digital elements. It's part of two new EU directives, one which revises the previous sale of goods directive, and the second, which is new but kind of goes hand in hand directly alongside the sale of goods directive, which is digital content. And where you've got goods with digital elements, like you gave an example earlier of a washing machine with Bluetooth or a household appliance that has some sort of connected elements to it, the digital elements are going to be covered by the revised Sale of Goods Directive. And this is coming in pretty soon. In Ireland, we are supposed to implement it by January 2022, so just over 6 months away. And the government has moved on this. Last month they published a consumer rights bill, which will be a fairly significant overhaul of the current Sale of Goods and Supply Services legislation. It's going to bring in a lot of new rules relating to goods with digital elements. One of those things is going to be an obligation on the trader to supply updates in order to keep the goods in conformity. So those updates might be security updates, updates to the sort of connectivity. And what I think is really interesting and well worth while emphasizing in this call is that the obligation on providing updates is on the trader, which means the retailer, not on the manufacturer. And we've only just started to hear, like, the EU directives were published about a year ago, the Irish legislation the draft about a month ago, but it's all going to come in by January of next year. And we're just starting to hear from some of our retailer clients working out how do we comply with this obligation to provide updates on the products to our consumers, because it's generally the manufacturer that devises the updates. So it's a good question, and it's definitely something for retailers to start thinking about.
An allied question there that came in the chat, actually. Can you advise on the need to inform CCPC where a software update is required for a device? Where are the boundaries here? That sort of crosses everybody, I think, a bit.
Okay, well, I'll start with, you can follow up with the CCPC ComReg aspect of it, but essentially the provision of updates is part of ensuring the ongoing conformity of the goods with the subjective and objective requirements. It's now a two-step test in the directives. And it's not enough to say, oh, well, they were fine the day that I supplied them. It was 6 months later, we discovered that there was a bit of a vulnerability or a glitch in the software or hackers device. There is an ongoing obligation to provide updates. I don't think that of itself will trigger what normally when you go to CCPC, it's because you have to take some sort of corrective action, i.e. you've discovered that goods that are on the market are unsafe and you're having to either do a withdrawal or some sort of corrective action program. But it's an interesting question as to where's the boundary between needing to provide an update which triggers a notification to CCPC versus an update which you're just doing to keep the goods in conformity. So maybe I'll pass back to you or Tara on that link between CCPC and ComReg.
The one piece I think I can contribute to that, if you have discovered, or if the manufacturer has discovered some non-conformance, and you're obliged to report the non-conformance, and if the software update happens to fix that, great. Equally though, if the software update, for instance, is going to change the frequencies the equipment operates at because standards have moved on and there's a new band opened up or something, that probably needs a new declaration of conformity to go with it. And I think I would hope that the revised Blue Guide will do something to do with some of this stuff. But Tara, I don't know if you want to contribute there. I think this has been very ill-defined all along.
Yes, I agree. It is ill-defined, but I guess what I would say is that ComReg and CCPC work very closely to get together because there are some blurred lines around where and what category products fall in. So I would say to anyone, if you think it's the CCPC and you give it to them, they will quickly determine whether it's for them or not and pass it on to ComReg. And if you come to ComReg in the first instance, we can assess and make a determination whether it falls within our remit, and then pass it on to CCPC if it doesn't. So we do work closely together and understand the boundaries of our various remits, and ensure that things are handled by the correct MSA when appropriate.
There's another one there that I think is for you, Tara, as well. Are there any plans to legislate for 5mm wave massive machine type communications?
Okay, so So 5G millimeter wave, I'm assuming here we're talking about the 26 gigahertz band, and earlier this year, ComReg published a study on the 26 gigahertz band, and that's ComReg document 2107. And it recently then published the submissions it received in response to that study, and that's document 2147. And it will be publishing a follow-up response to that study and the responses received, and that will determine what next steps it makes in regard to the 26 gigahertz band. I guess I would make it clear that, you know, ComReg assigns spectrum on a technology and service neutral basis. So there won't be a licensing regime called 5G millimeter wave massive machine type communications, and it'll be done on a technology and service neutral basis in accordance with any relevant EC or ECC decisions that might be appropriate to that. I'm not entirely sure if that answers the question.
Well, if it doesn't, if the question, I can come back with something else. And the one thing I would say to that as well is ComReg does run very open consultation processes and will listen to submissions. If somebody wants to make a submission to something, do so.
Indeed, yeah.
It will be read and looked at carefully. And I think the final question we've got there is, what about the green dot? Does that have to be on packaging of products sold in Ireland? I think that's probably for you, Wendy.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, often you see the green dot alongside the wheelie bin crossed out symbol that's required under the WE regs. But the green dot is more common across Europe and it's not mandatory in Ireland. To use the green dot, you'd have to be a member or have a license to use it from REPAC. And so if you want to use the green dot, yes, you can arrange it through REPAC, but it's not mandatory in Ireland.
With that, I think we've finished just about on time and there's no more outstanding questions. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today. I hope it's been useful. And again, please do fill in the feedback forms. I'd also like to thank our panelists, and I'm very grateful to ComReg for taking part in this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.